It was the early hours of 11th of May. The once imperial capital city of Shahjahanabad was yet half asleep. That is when a lot of red coats crossed over the river Yamuna. Red coats is a term used often to describe the soldiers of East India Company. Their uniforms were of crimson red color and hence the name. These red coats scurried across the plains of Yamuna and quickly reached the Red Fort, the imperial mansion of the Mughal ruler, Bahadur Shah Zafar. Of course, a ruler by now only in name. They pushed their way through the openings or the gates of the Red Fort and darted to the place where Bahadur Shah's personal mansion was. Bahadur Shah Zafar, now a grand old man, a pensioner of East India Company, was rudely woken up to all the commotion outside. He couldn't believe his eyes. Before him were scores of soldiers from the East India Company who had on the previous day started a revolt against the East India Company's rule. They had killed their officers, taken as much ammo and weapons as they could, and darted to Bahadur Shah Zafar's Red Fort. They were now asking him or pleading him to assume the leadership of this revolt. Bahadur Shah vacillated. Bahadur Shah vacillated because he was himself a pensioner of East India Company and his writ was only limited to the premises of the Red Fort itself, not even beyond that. He wasn't sure of what the company soldiers were up to, and he was perhaps even more unsure as to what he could do to lead this revolt. After all, he only had the grand name of Mughals and nothing beyond that. But nevertheless, he was convinced and he gave in. He accepted the leadership of a revolt of 1857. Soon the soldiers went berserk and people in the city also rose up. English resident Simon Fraser was killed. So were some other Europeans. Christians also were attacked inside of Delhi. The news that Delhi was now rebelling against the East India Company's rule spread like wildfire. In a matter of days and weeks, many other storm centers sprung up in this very seminal development in the history of British rule in India. Today, in this series of modern Indian history, dear students, we will be understanding the revolt of 1857, its background, its course, and also its significance, its outcome. Let's get started. Before we go ahead and try to detail how the revolt actually took place, it is crucial to take a quick recap. I have discussed with you in earlier classes that the British rule in India was met with an Indian response. Indian response could be understood in two different frameworks, a traditional response and a modern response. Traditional response will be based on goals of shifting the hands of the clock back. That is to go back to earlier feudal type society, economy and polity. It will be led by feudal and semi-feudal kind of leaders, Rajas, Nawabs, chiefs of military of the princely states, so on and so forth. Their methods will be violent, traditional and crude. These traditional responses will be localized and will be brief, intense and ultimately suppressed by the Britishers. If you see, the revolt of 1857 shows almost all of these characteristics, except that it is on a much more grand scale. So one can say safely that revolt of 1857 is actually like an epitome of the traditional response that Indians gave to establishment of British rule. The failure as well as the contribution of revolt of 1857 will ultimately slowly transform Indian response to a more modern type of response in the second half of 19th century. Today we will try to understand the specificities of revolt of 1857. As we go ahead, it is crucial to first distinguish between two key terms which we will come across whenever we discuss revolt of 1857. What are these terms? Number one is mutiny. What is meant by mutiny? Mutiny is collective disobedience of rules and regulations within the armed forces. It's crucial to note the difference that the term mutiny is used in context of general disobedience by the armed forces. Whereas in case of civil population, the term that is used is revolt. Rebellion of people against established authority and power is basically a revolt. In case of revolt of 1857, we will see that it is sparked off by revolt of the sepoys. But then ultimately, it does not remain confined or limited in its scope to the armed forces only. It will be followed by a revolt of civilian population, which will of course include peasants, zamindars, rajas, talukdars, jagidars, all the sections of the then Indian society. So in that sense, the revolt of 1857 is unique for having a combination of both of these. Now, it is not as if a mutiny was taking place for the first time in context of East India Company. There had been several incidences in the past where sepoys of East India Company had revolted. On the screen, the picture that you see is that of an Indian Subedar of East India Company's army, a depiction of him, of course. Now, this position of Subedar was actually the highest rank that an Indian troop could rise to during the company's times. These Indian troops had several grievances. No doubt, the service of the company came with a lot of perks. You had assured salary. You had a lot of prestige associated with the East India Company since it was winning all the wars almost that it was fighting. And yes, Indian troops were also very loyal and committed to East India Company as it was their paymaster. But then it wasn't as if everything was hunky-dory. Very often, for multiple reasons, the troops of East India Company, the Indian troops, found a lot of grievances against their paymaster. These grievances led to several incidences of mutinies earlier also. Prominent amongst these grievances were discrimination in pay and promotions. Pay and promotions. The salaries given to Indian troops vis-a-vis the European troops were markedly different. European troops were paid much higher salary. They were also given more allowances by the company, whereas Indian troops were not indulged in a similar manner. When it came to promotions, there was a clear-cut dividing line. An Indian troop, howsoever great he might be in terms of his military genius, but he could not rise beyond the rank of a Subedar. Whereas a European who has freshly come from Europe to India would be commanding him and would be, subjecting him to a lot of humiliation. Despite the European being rather green or fresh in the field of military, whereas the Indian being very experienced and also successful in his, endeavors. Second, mistreatment by British officials. Very often Indian troops were humiliated, insulted, racist slurs were very common, and consequently, the Indian troop always felt that his services are not being recognized sufficiently by the British officials. This kind of humiliation led to a lot of hidden discontent amongst Indian soldiers. To make things worse, he was now not going to be paid the foreign service allowance. Whenever the troops of East India Company were sent to distant areas, may it be in Afghanistan, in Sindh, or in Burma, they earlier were promised extra allowance for serving in distant or foreign lands. So when the Bengal army goes to an area way beyond Bengal, the troops were supposed to get such an allowance. These allowances were discontinued for Indian troops, whereas European troops continued to get that. This was patently discriminative. Furthermore, there were also religious objections to certain rules that were being brought in by East India Company. The General Services Enlistment Act in 1856 had made it very clear to the troops that they will have to serve abroad also, and which may require travel by sea. Now, people serving in the Bengal army, the troops of the Bengal army, generally came from upper caste backgrounds. And traveling by sea to a foreign land was considered a taboo back then. It was called as Kala Pani. According to traditional beliefs, it was held that if a person travels by sea, then he loses his Varna status. The general enlistment rules, service enlistment rules, they clearly mentioned that the troops will have to travel abroad also, which will necessarily involve travel by sea. This had made Indian soldiers very edgy. Further, these troops were ultimately coming from that same stock of civilian population. And whatever was happening with civilian population on account of British rule was certainly going to have an impact on these troops also. The exploitative nature of British rule, the rampant annexations, the constant racist kind of attitude of the Britishers towards Indians, all of these things were naturally going to affect the troops also. Lastly, traveling by seas or Kalapani, as we discussed earlier in enlistment rules, was one of the major reasons why Indian troops of Bengal Army particularly were really concerned about their service in East India Company's army. Therefore, we see time and again, for multiple reasons, many troops had earlier rebelled against East India Company. 1764 in Bengal, there was a mutiny during Lord Clive's time itself. 1806, the Vellore Mutiny is very famous, which we have discussed in a preceding class also. It was a brief but a very intense mutiny. In 1824, the 47th Native Infantry also rebelled against the East India Company's rule. The 47th Native Infantry was made to march from Mathura to Barakpur near Calcutta. It's a 1600 kilometers distance. And from Barakpur, they had to be taken to Burma, where the Burmese, first Anglo-Burmese war was to be fought. Now, tired and weary, these soldiers wanted bullock carts to ferry their personal items. But the bullocks was not available because many of the bullocks had been taken over for the seaborne invasion of Burma, which was going to happen from Madras. For all of these reasons, the troops were told that either you travel by sea so that you will be, sufficiently rested, or if you want to travel by land, then in that case, you will have to carry your stuff yourself. No extra allowances were being paid for that. East India Company was not ready to procure the expensive bullocks for the sake of the soldiers. This led to a mutiny by the 47th Native Infantry. The term infantry basically means foot soldiers. East India Company's foot soldiers, infantry. They rebelled, and we see that East India Company brutally suppressed this particular rebellion. The effect of this rebellion was seen in a subsequent mutiny in 1825 in Assam also. Again, with the same sort of grievances, we'll see a rebellion in Assam in 1825. 1838 in Solapur, and then from 1844 to 52, we will see multiple rebellions by troops of the East India Company. So these type of mutinies were actually not new to East India Company. What will happen in 1857 has a long track record of earlier such incidences as far as the army is concerned. Before we go ahead and try to understand the specific developments that will lead to Revolt of 1857, let me quickly tell you that we have something very important to offer for you. Starting 10th of October, we are starting our new batches, that is Prelims to Interview Foundation batch, which will have silver, gold and platinum validities of 1 year, 2 year and 3 years respectively. Now, based on when exactly you plan to take your next attempt, based on that, you can enroll for any one of these batches. Although the content and all the notes, material, everything is going to be the same, the difference will be in terms of the validity as to how long you can access that content. Depending on what is your target, if it's 2024, then you can enroll for silver validity. If you are attempting for 2025, then in that case, gold and platinum thereafter. This gives you the freedom to pace your preparation based on your need, so that you don't have to hurry through your preparation and not do it effectively. So for that reason, StudyIQ IAS has come out with this new offering, which will have 3 different validities. These batches will have all the features that we have discussed with you in the earlier offerings of P2I batch. It will include live classroom teaching, online mode, live online classroom teaching, which will cover all the subjects of the syllabus in a very detailed manner. Dear students, expert faculties of StudyIQ IAS who have themselves advanced in their civil services attempts, those faculties will be teaching you in the online classroom. Furthermore, to ensure that you are never left with constant touch of guidance, there will be dedicated mentors who you can always reach out to at any point through different social media platforms. These mentors will help you to pace your preparation and plan it based on your specific needs. A customized plan will be prepared for you by these mentors. At your doorstep, you will get the best possible material for preparing for this exam. It will include a lot of books and other copious notes so that your preparation gets the right sort of direction that it requires. Apart from this, there will be a lot of tests, daily mains questions, weekly prelims based tests. Every day, in addition to the regular class, you will get a class of daily current affairs also personally in your dashboard. Using this, you can prepare current affairs also in a much more effective manner. In this manner, guys, we will prepare the entire syllabus for civil services examination in an effective way. Keeping in mind the changing nature of prelims examination, we have also included a special last leg course for the prelims, so that you get sufficient confidence in handling multiple choice questions. The focus in this will be on the the factual aspect of the syllabus, and at the same time developing the right exam skill and approach also. Dear students, if you are able to crack the prelims examination, then in Delhi you will be called at StudyIQ IAS's office and you will be given a residential program without any extra cost for mains preparation. Your entire journey between prelims and mains will be taken care of by StudyIQ IAS. You won't even have to go about looking for a location for putting up. Everything from your lodging, boarding, and of course, your preparation will be taken care of by the StudyIQ IAS itself. Once the student qualifies for the interview, then of course there will be special training programs for interview, which will include a lot of mock interviews from senior retired government officials, so that you are sufficiently groomed for taking on the interview challenge. End to end, your preparation journey is taken care of in these batches. You couldn't have it better than this, guys. This, as I keep saying, is the one-stop solution for all your preparation needs. Enroll immediately. 10th of October is approaching rather very fast. You can use my code JDLIVE for this purpose and you will get a handsome discount for this batch. All right. Now, apart from this, if you want to download my notes and get updates about my lectures, you can reach me on my Telegram channel. You can follow me on my Telegram channel, Jawwad Kazi UPSC Preparation. And this is the link for it. You can use the QR code as well to reach my channel. All right. This is the map of India, guys, just before the revolt of 1857 is sparked. These areas which are colored in yellowish orange, those are actually areas where the Indian princes ruled, whereas all other areas are under direct British control. Some of the major storm centers that we must know about are Delhi over here. Then you have Rohilkhand area, Lucknow. You will have here Jhansi, Allahabad, Gwalior. Okay. Calcutta, of course, Bengal wasn't as affected, but then we should know where exactly these places are. So these are some of the major areas. Yes, apart from this, there will be small occurrings in other areas too, but then the most significant centers will be Delhi, Kanpur, Jhansi, Gwalior, Lucknow, and some other cities in the central and northern Indian plains. South India largely will remain unaffected because of this. There will be some disturbances in western part of India, but mostly the center of gravity will be in the north and central plains of India. All right. Now let's get started and see who will be the crucial participants in this revolt of 1857. Revolt of 1857 will see participation, first of all, from the sepoys of East India Company who will rebel. Around this time, East India Company had an army which was twice the size of the army of Britain. The army of Britain is different from the army of East India Company. The total number of troops that EIC had before revolt of 1857 was 2,30,000 plus. 2,30,000 plus troops. And out of these, half of the troops are going to rebel almost, which is a very sizable number. In the remaining half, of course, you have the European soldiers, which will be about 45 to 50,000, somewhere in that ballpark range. So you can imagine the kind of mutiny that sepoys will do during revolt of 1857. Nawabs, kings and queens, the feudal, semi-feudal elements of the yesteryears who had lost their earlier position and privilege, who were being exploited by the British rule, they will naturally find this as a great opportunity to fight back and remove the yoke of East India Company's rule from their neck. So many Nawabs, kings, Maharajas, all of these type of people, Zamindars, they will also rebel. Zamindars and Talukdars who were hurt because of British policies, the revenue settlements that the British brought in, especially permanent settlement, which led to a lot of transfer of land, had disappointed Zamindars and Talukdars, not only in Bengal, but also in other parts of the British areas, British ruled areas. A lot of these Zamindars and Talukdars from Avad were affected because of East India Company's policies. Then these will also be joined by common civilians and peasants. Common civilians and peasants who had seen how the change of rule to East India Company had worsened their socio-economic well-being. The economic exploitative policies of East India Company was naturally having an effect right to the last person in the society. Civilians and peasants were discontented because of EIC's rule, so they will also join it. The clerics of Muslim community too will play a crucial role in this, as the transfer of rule from the earlier Mughal rule to East India Company had led to a lot of privileges for this particular section also affected. This will bring in the Muslim clerics also in sizable numbers, which will have an impact on the overall revolt. So these are the important participants, guys, that we will see. Now let us go into the specific causes that will lead to revolt of 1857. The causes of revolt of 1857 can be divided into immediate causes and the long-term causes. We'll discuss each one of these. Immediate cause was about the kind of cartridges that East India Company had brought in. Apart from this, there were also a lot of conspiracies or a lot of rumors going on about the atta, the flour that was being served to the troops. Then the cancellation of bhatta, or the special allowance that the troops got, was also another important immediate cause. We'll discuss all of these in detail shortly. But what we must know is the long-term causes in detail. The long-term causes. There's a very famous couplet in Urdu which says, "Waqt karta hai parvarish barson." I'll translate it. "Waqt karta hai parvarish barson, hadisa यूं ही अचानक नहीं होता." वक्त करता है परवरिश बरसों, हादसा यूं ही अचानक नहीं होता. Basically, it means that a big accident or a big event, a big convulsion does not happen overnight. The reasons or causes of it are brewing over a very long time. The revolt of 1857 was also not any different. It had its own political, economic, socio-religious, military causes as well as some outside influences, which we are now going to detail and see. After this, we'll talk about the immediate causes also. Okay. Let's talk about the political causes first. What are the political causes? Political causes, number one is policy of effective control. In this policy of effective control, East India Company was constantly trying to have more and more control on the Indian princely states. Even when these states were not annexed, even when the native princes were still ruling, East India Company's goal was to maximize their iron grip on these Indian princes so that the resources of this area could be squeezed for the company's rule. This policy of effective control had disappointed many Indian rulers as well as all those who were associated with them. If the Indian ruler is not doing well, then naturally people who are associated with his court, it might be his ministers, his generals, soldiers, courtiers, people who are dependent for their livelihood on the court, all of those people are going to get affected because of it. So a big section in princely states was not happy, of course, with East India Company's policies. This was specifically done through the concept of subsidiary alliance. In our previous sessions, we have discussed how subsidiary alliance was used as a master stroke by the East India Company. By having the Indian prince accept the subsidiary alliance, East India Company was able to maintain its troops at the cost of Indian princes. These troops were kept at the headquarters or the capitals of the Indian princes at their cost. This enabled a better control on the Indian princes, gave a great strategic advantage to EIC for movement of troops in different areas, and always kept wars away from their territories. The British resident appointed at the court was a source of influence as well as espionage for East India Company. This master stroke naturally was tremendously resented by Indian powers. As if this was not enough, the Britishers brought about the doctrine of lapse. Despite the loyalties that Indian princes had pledged to East India Company's rule, Lord Dalhousie uniformly and vigorously implemented the policy of doctrine of lapse. Under this policy, several Indian princes were disallowed the right of adoption. When a prince did not have male heir to succeed him, then in India traditionally adoption was used. But East India Company said not anymore. Indian princely states will not be able to adopt to continue their rule. If there is no male progeny, then several Indian states were vulnerable to annexation by the company's rule. Jhansi, Satara, Baghat, Sambalpur, Udaipur, several Indian princely states were affected by this doctrine of lapse by Lord Dalhousie. Furthermore, there was also extinction of many native Indian states at the hands of East India Company in the recent decades. Extinction of these native Indian states very terribly affected the fortunes of not just the rulers, but also all those who were associated with them. These princely states had traditionally been seen as representatives of the local communities. The prestige of those princely states was the prestige of that particular region. And when East India Company, in a very heartless or cold manner, finished off these long-standing Indian princely states, it led to tremendous political discontent. Many people were disgruntled because of these measures of East India Company. The most recent and the most consequent for revolt of 1857 was the annexation of Avad in 1856. Avad was annexed on the alibi of misrule of the Nawab. Misrule of the Nawab. This misrule of the Nawab or alleged misrule of the Nawab was just a convenient ploy used by East India Company to get this cherry fall in their mouth. And I'm quoting this from no less than Lord Dalhousie's paper itself. He had said this, that cherry, meaning Avad, will one day fall in our mouth, and it did fall on a flimsy reason or excuse of misrule by the Nawab. as if the East India Company was a very welfareist kind of a state. They were blaming the Nawab for misrule. Now, when Awadh was annexed, it directly affected a lot of troops in the Bengal army. Many troops from the Bengal army came from the areas of Awadh. When Awadh was annexed and people of Awadh were now subjected to East India Company's policies, they understood firsthand what kind of rule East India Company actually exerted on its people. This will become very consequential for the revolt in 1857. Awadh will be an important storm center. Lucknow will see a lot of fighting between the rebels and the East India Company. So Awadh was a very crucial development in this context. Apart from Awadh, the kind of treatment that was being meted out to Indian princes, the humiliating treatment, was also making Indians disappointed with EIC rule. A person no less than Bahadur Shah Zafar, the last Mughal ruler, Bahadur Shah Zafar, was told that he will be the last Mughal to occupy Red Fort, and after him, his family will have to vacate even that premises, and they will have to shift to a more humble, accommodation in south of Delhi. So they have to leave Shahjahanabad per se, their traditional abode, the precincts of Red Fort. That was the only thing that the Mughals were now left with, the Red Fort, and even that was to be taken over from them. Earlier, the coins struck in the name of the Mughal ruler were already stopped. He was just living on a small pension given by East India Company. Similarly, many other Indian princes were also subjected to similar type of treatments. Furthermore, pensions of many Indian princes who were earlier promised pensions were also stopped. For example, Nana Sahib. Nana Sahib was the adopted son of Bajirao II. You might remember our lecture on the Marathas, the Anglo-Maratha wars. At the end of Third Anglo-Maratha War, the Peshwaship was abolished and the Peshwa of Pune was banished and sent to Kanpur, modern-day Uttar Pradesh. Bithur in Kanpur was where he was to live, and he was given a pension by East India Company. Bajirao II did not have a son, so he had adopted Nana Sahib. Now, Nana Sahib technically should have got the pension earlier given to Bajirao II, but that pension was also stopped. Similar fate fell upon Rani Jindan also, the youngest queen of Maharaja Ranjit Singh, and it was her son Dalip Singh who was the ruler of Punjab. Now, she was taken away from Punjab under the Treaty of Bhairoval and sent to Banaras and then later to Nepal, and her pension was also stopped. These type of treatments were very humiliating to Indian princes. And back then, as I told you, the Indian prince represented the honor and dignity of his subject. When their rulers or erstwhile rulers were subjected to these type of treatments, the people certainly felt affected because of it. And lastly was the sheer foreignness of the rule. The fact that East India Company had come from more than 20,000 nautical miles away. It was different in terms of religion, in terms of race, in terms of culture. In every sense, East India Company's rule was different from Indian perspective. It was completely foreign and alien. Its systems, its pillars, everything was different. And therefore, this was certainly, a point of pain for Indians. It was a humiliating thing that such a foreign entity was able to rule such a massive territory, such a huge population, with great ancient history and heritage. All of these will then become political factors in the revolt of 1857. While political factors are important, it is economic factors that often compel a lot of people to take desperate measures. The East India Company's rule had led to a lot of economic exploitation of the people. While political factors, remain still distant, economic factors, they affect right up to your hearth. Your home gets affected because of that. And consequently, economic factors are as equally important as political factors. Within economic factors, the first reason was land revenue settlements. The three types of settlements that Britishers had brought about: the permanent settlement, Rayotwari settlement, and Mahalwari settlement in different parts of British India. All of these three settlements had ended up doing basically the same thing, that is exploitation of Indians. These land revenue settlements had, torn asunder the traditional fabric of the village economy. Because of these land revenue settlements, there were a lot of disruptions for the Indians, and it led to a lot of discontent against the Britishers. Specifically, within the revenue settlements was the high revenue demand. The high revenue demand that Britishers had on the common peasants made it very difficult for them to bear it. Generally speaking, 50% used to be the revenue demand that East India Company had, which was quite exorbitant for the Indian peasant. The policies that permanent settlement brought about led to the zamindar becoming the owner of the land. Land, because of British policies, now became a saleable commodity. It could be bought and sold freely. Earlier in India, the system was more nuanced. The zamindar had his set of rights and the peasant also had his set of rights. It wasn't as if the zamindar could do as per his whims and fancies. As long as the peasant was paying the rent, the zamindar was by no means allowed to kick out the peasant. But now with the zamindar made the owner of the land, the peasant was completely at the disposal of the zamindar. The zamindar exploited these peasants, and consequently we'll see there will be a lot of transfer of land, alienation of peasants that will take place. The zamindar himself also wasn't very secure. As long as he was paying the revenue to the state, he would occupy his rights or he would enjoy his rights. But if he was not able to pay the state in time, then his rights were very easily, auctioned off to somebody else. Consequently, we'll see a lot of transfer of land will also take place during British rule, and thereby pushing a big section of the population into penury. Back then, land was the most important means of production. And once you are denied the access of land, whether as peasant or as the zamindar, it will naturally have a very grave impact on your economic well-being. Around this time, money lenders also had penetrated in rural areas. The demand for payment of rent and revenue on time gave the opportunity or space for money lenders to penetrate deep inside the countryside so that these peasants and landlords would pay the respective amounts due to them. Money lenders often used the lack of knowledge and literacy amongst the peasants, and even in case of some better off sections of the society, to enrich themselves. Consequently, we'll see that there will be a lot of discontent against the money lenders who were basically here acting as agents of the state. Though not appointed directly, but indirectly, they are helping out the state. Handicrafts industry parallelly had been ruined by the Britishers. East India Company during this phase was in its mercantilist exploitation phase. It wanted to enrich itself through trade. And to enrich itself through trade, it had to kill the competition of Indian rivals. Therefore, we'll see that East India Company will impose a lot of policies on the handicrafts section, which will lead to its economic dislocation. Traditionally, Indian handicrafts had been in great demand world over. The handicrafts of Bengal particularly were very, very famous. But then the policies that East India Company brought about with respect to its trade led to the ruin of the handicrafts in India, that sector in India. A British journalist had written, I'm not quoting verbatim, but the essence is there. The famines that were caused after establishment of British rule. During those famines, the bones of weavers of Bengal were bleaching the soil. So many people had died because of the economic dislocation that was brought about by British rule. Britishers were careful in imposing a one-way free trade on Indians. When Indian goods went to Britain, they were charged a custom duty of 200 to 400%. But when it was vice versa, British goods coming to India, that would be in the range of 2 to 8%. So very nominal custom duty on British imports, but a very heavy one when Indian exports went there. Naturally, this would affect the economic well-being of Indians. There was constant pressure on agriculture because of all of this. With the ruin of economy, handicrafts, all the problems that were happening in the ruling circles, naturally a lot of people in the city areas, they were unemployed. And these unemployed people had no other choice but to go to the rural areas. And when they went to rural areas, they would seek employment in agriculture basically. Therefore, there was increasing pressure on agriculture, more and more people coming and becoming dependent on agriculture. This is the reason why, guys, we see disguised unemployment in Indian agriculture even to this date. The legacy of British rule had led to that increased pressure on agriculture, causing disguised unemployment. All right. Lastly, in economic reasons was the slow, steady, but constant drain of wealth from India. India's capital, India's wealth was being taken away from India to Britain. As a British person would himself remark, our system works like a sponge. It absorbs the maximum from the Ganges and then deposits it over the Thames. That was the type of system that British had devised. Naturally, all of this will fuel a lot of anger in Indians. Now, as if economic aspects were not enough, the socio-religious policies of the British were also equally offensive for the Indians. Many of their policies interfered with the day-to-day life of common Indians. It affected some beliefs that Indians had held for centuries, if not millennia. And some of these policies are, here on the screen. Number one is the racial nature of this rule. The Britishers in this age were firm believers in the concept of white man's burden. That the white races are superior, more civilized, they are intelligent, they are brave, whereas the other races are, they are literally at subhuman level. And it is the white man's burden to actually civilize these people, to tell them what values they must actually aspire for, how they must lead their lives. All of that is to be taught by the white man to these people. This naturally was insulting for a people who had great civilizations in the past. When Europe was in the dark ages, India was doing pretty well even back then. In the ancient times, we boast of a lot of achievements in Indus Valley civilization, and then subsequently through all the phases of history, Indians had many achievements to their credit, where Europeans were still in hunting gathering kind of stages in those times. For such people, this type of an arrogant attitude was something that they could not take lying low. Interference in local customs and practices. The Britishers had stopped slavery, they had stopped female infanticide, they had stopped human sacrifice. Of course, these are good and positive measures. But back then, Indians felt that they are interfering in our local practices. Sati was abolished, widow remarriage was allowed in 1856. All of these were seen by traditional minded Indians or Orthodox Indians as interference by the British in our customs and practices. Moreover, it was felt that slowly, steadily, the British rule is trying to take Indians towards Christianity. This got further credence when the Lex Loci Act was passed in 1850, which allowed people to inherit their ancestral wealth, property, irrespective of change of religion. Now, this particularly led credence to the fears that there is a undercurrent, there is a hidden, agenda of making people, more people converting people to Christianity. Missionaries were also allowed in India after Charter Act of 1813. Missionaries were allowed to go about setting up their institutions, schools, hospitals, so on and so forth. And of course, the agenda of missionaries back then was to propagate Christianity. This official support to the missionaries was seen as something problematic by the Indians. The state was siding with a particular religion. Social reforms were also not welcomed by all sections of the society. Many of these reforms were seen as interference in India's internal matters. The British government, in its desire to extract the maximum resources, started to tax Waqf lands and temple properties. Waqf lands are Muslim charitable lands dedicated for some religious or charitable purposes. These lands traditionally in India were not taxed, and same was the case with temple lands. But then these properties also were now being taxed at the same rate, which Indians felt was unfair. These were the social causes. Apart from social causes, there were many other military causes also. Military causes, number one was religious interference. British Army used to maintain a chaplain, and there used to be priests and also missionaries who would go about talking to Indian troops. And they would, of course, in those times, try to convince the Indian troops that how their religion was better than what Indians were practicing. And this was, something very detestable for Indians, that their religion is being undermined through this process. So religious interference was disliked by Indian troops. The famous Vellore Mutiny, which we had discussed earlier, had taken place because of interference in religious practices. Indian troops were told that they could not have long mustaches, that they will have to wear a certain type of hat, they will not be able to have beards, so on and so forth. These kind of ideas were not liked by Indians. While serving in the East India Company, Indian troops had displayed remarkable bravery. They had shown great military skill and genius. But then, despite all these things, the attitude of the British officers was always that of racial arrogance. They would speak to Indian troops with a lot of slurs. They always abused Indians. And this, the Indians felt, was completely unjust and unfair despite all their services to them. Their salaries were also low as compared to the European troops. So, from what I have read, it used to be around 7 rupees for an Indian troop. And this salary had remained constant for a very long time. Whereas the salaries of European troops were higher, and also they were revised. Promotions, as we have seen earlier, also were limited only to the rank of Subedar and not above that. An Indian could not become a regular officer in the British Army. They also had to often serve away from home in distant lands, say in Afghanistan, in Burma, Sindh, all of these places. And this was considered as, very difficult for people, especially troops coming from upper castes. Serving in distant areas often used to lead to social boycott in their local communities, because people in the local communities in the villages would suspect that this person who has served in Afghanistan or say in Sindh or has gone to Burma, how would he have observed all the diktats of the religion while serving in such distant lands? There are so many, things that a person has to practice back then in that society. All of those things were not possible while serving in such a foreign land. That meant social ostracization at home. This was naturally very, hurtful for Indian troops. Bhatta, the military allowance that was given for foreign service, was also stopped. Free postage was now stopped, and troops also had to pay for sending letters back home. And they felt this is the smallest of things that East India Company should actually do for them. Already Post Office Act, first 1837, had been passed. Later it will be again passed in 1854. So they felt that postage should at least be free since they are on government duty. But East India Company wants revenue in that also. And ultimately, these soldiers, remember this term, guys, they were peasants in uniform. These troops at the core were peasants. Their families, their fathers, their brothers were actually tilling the soil. And when East India Company's economic policies were affecting the peasants, these troops also could not remain isolated from it. They knew the hardships their fathers and brothers and cousins they were facing while these people were serving as loyal troops of East India Company. These became the military causes for the revolt. Apart from this, there were some outside causes also which influenced the troops and later Indians in general to revolt against East India Company. What were these outside causes? Guys, the Britishers, Company Bahadur, as it was called back then, had built up a very formidable reputation of invincibility. In every major war that they had fought, they had emerged victorious. Yes, there were exceptions when there were draws, But then largely, if you try to, have a deduction of the conquest of India by Britishers, in most of the cases, East India Company had been victorious. And this had built an aura around the Company Bahadur of invincibility. This aura of invincibility was actually undermined by some international events. Events like the reverses in Anglo-Burmese War initially. Yes, Burma was ultimately defeated, Treaty of Yandabu was signed, its territories were taken over, but in initial battles, there were some reverses. So that shield of invincibility as such was pierced in Burma also. Then came the disaster of First Anglo-Afghan War. This disaster had totally exposed the East India Company's military prowess. The troops of East India Company had been slaughtered in this first war. Yes, again, East India Company made a statement by going back and taking Kabul, but it had to concede the rule to Dost Muhammad, the earlier deposed ruler. This showed that it wasn't as if East India Company's armies were not defeatable. This war had given confidence to the state of Gwalior, and Gwalior, after First Afghan War, had rebelled against the East India Company's rule, although it was suppressed. This was before Revolt of 1857. The Scindias had fought. Reverses in Crimean War in Europe, 1854-56. The Crimean War was being fought near the Black Sea on account of an expanding Russian Empire. British and French did not want the Russians to advance towards the Mediterranean Sea, and therefore they allied with the Ottomans and fought against the Russians. In this war, the British army had suffered a lot of defeats, although ultimately it will win the war, but it had suffered a lot of reverses, and these reverses had given a lot of hopes to Indians. It also affected the military hegemony of the Britishers consequently. All of this had affected British military hegemony in India, and this will encourage Indian troops to rebel against their paymaster, East India Company. I hope you got this, guys. So we have seen the major political, social, and economic causes apart from military and outside influences. Now let us see what was the immediate cause of this revolt. Immediate cause of this revolt was the issue of greased cartridges. Issue of greased cartridges. Of course, you know the story from your school times itself, but a quick overlook of that is necessary here. Earlier, the British used to use the Brown Bess rifle, for their armies. But then later this was substituted by the Enfield rifle. This Enfield rifle had bullets which were sealed in a cartridge. That cartridge had to be bitten off with the teeth, and then the bullet could be inserted in the muzzle. Then it was to be fired. It was rumored that these greased cartridges were actually made of fats of cows and pigs. Now, cows being holy for the Hindus and pigs being profane for Muslims, biting that off with your teeth was something very unimaginable for Hindus as well as Muslims. And consequently, there were a lot of rumblings against introduction of these cartridges. And East India Company did try to put it across to their superiors. I mean, the soldiers, they tried to put it across to their superiors that we have reservations about using these cartridges. But then East India Company did not relent. And it did not relent till something very significant happened in some of the military cantonments. In Behrampur, Barakpur, and Meerut, in these places, troops of East India Company ultimately will feel compelled to rebel against their senior officers. They will put aside all their regimental loyalties. Now, the regimental loyalties are really drilled into the soldier. Okay, that is a system that has continued in modern armies also. The regiment that the soldier is attached to, he is really, mentally he is indoctrinated with the value of serving that particular regiment. The commitment, loyalty for that regiment is very high. Despite all of that drilling for several years, these troops rebelled and killed their senior officers, which will spark the revolt of 1857. After this revolt, these troops, as we saw in the story at the start of this lecture, requested Bahadur Shah Zafar, the nominal emperor of India, to actually assume the leadership of this revolt. This selection of Bahadur Shah Zafar, it had a lot of significance and meaning attached to it. The choice of Bahadur Shah Zafar made this mutiny into a larger revolt by Indians. Why was it significant on part of the troops to choose Bahadur Shah Zafar? The reasons are very obvious. Mughals were the traditional symbols of India's political unity. It was under the Mughals that a large swath of the Indian subcontinent had been united under one single power. And the descendant of that dynasty was still there, although nominal, but he still had that, same title. He had that same prestige, even if in namesake, and therefore his assumption of leadership would give this a definite revolutionary and political character, is what the rebels understood. With this step, they transformed their mutiny. A mutiny is an illegal thing. You are insubordinating your officers, and therefore, consequently, you are liable for capital punishment. But when that transforms into a revolutionary war, it gives a very decisive, political outlook to it. It gives a very decisive political outlook to it. And now it does not just remain a mutiny. It assumes a much wider character, which has political as well as other elements attached to it. And in that sense, the troops were really wise actually to have convinced, cajoled, or whatever the case might be, to get Bahadur Shah Zafar to accept the leadership of revolt of 1857. So this will mark off or start out this particular event. Now let us see where all this event will spread. What will be the storm centers of this event? The epicenters of the revolt. The most important one, of course, will be Delhi. Since Bahadur Shah himself is there in Delhi, and that being the imperial capital of Mughals, this was the most important storm center. Here the revolt was led by General Bakht Khan, who was the leader of Bareilly troops of East India Company. So these troops had come from Bareilly, where they were earlier posted. The Mughal Emperor Bahadur Shah Zafar was the nominal leader in Delhi. He's an old man, and although in his heydays, I've read some history about him. In his heydays, he was supposed to be a very fit and agile kind of a person, but at this ripe age, he wasn't in any position to lead things militarily. So he's just a nominal figurehead as such. He was a good poet, and he did write some poetry to motivate and encourage Indians to fight against the Britishers. And one couplet that immediately comes to my mind is, जब तलक गाजियों में बू रहेगी ईमान की, जब तलक गाजियों में बू रहेगी ईमान की, तख्ते लंदन तक चलेगी तेग हिंदुस्तान की. As long as the fighters have that spirit of, commitment inside of them, till that point, India's sword will reach right up to the throne of London. So that is what he tried to do, motivating the troops. So Delhi, after that comes Kanpur. In Kanpur, Nana Sahib, the Peshwa who was banished from Pune, okay, he is going to lead. He is the adopted son of Bajirao II. Since he was the adopted son, Britishers said that as per doctrine of lapse, you will not be considered as the successor, and therefore you will not be given pension that Bajirao II was getting. Nana Sahib, naturally, he is from that same proud, although not from his biological descent, but then he is from that same proud Peshwa family, which has in 18th century done some really formidable kind of military expeditions. So he also assumes leadership in Kanpur, and he will fight against East India Company. In Lucknow, Begum Hazrat Mahal assumed the leadership in for his son Birjis Qadir. Birjis Qadir was not accepted as Nawab. Of course, Avad was annexed, so Birjis Qadir was in no position to become the Nawab of Avad. So his mother, Begum Hazrat Mahal, she will lead the revolt in case of Avad. Okay. She will fight the Britishers quite bravely, and Lucknow will be an important storm center in this revolt. In Kanpur, there is an important incident that we must remember. In Kanpur, it so happened that some of the British people who were trying to escape from Kanpur using boats down the rivers, they were actually assaulted by the Indian troops, and many of them were brutally killed in that process. It is not very clear or evident whether it was ordered, but it is believed by historians that Nana Sahib had never ordered that civilians should be attacked and killed. But when these people were escaping, at that time, some incidences did take place where there were attacks, and a lot of people were, European people were killed in that process, and that was used as a propaganda tool by East India Company. That particular event, just like you remember the black hole event in case of Battle of Plassey, how Lord Clive had used that. Similarly, this event will be used, and there will be a lot of retribution on Kanpur. When East India Company will get back Kanpur's control, they will literally order a mass slaughter. I mean, not in so many words, but practically they killed a lot of people in Kanpur, much more harsh than in other places. So that was Lucknow. After Lucknow will be the formidable case of Jhansi, where, as famously we all know, Rani Lakshmi Bai, she led the sepoys in Jhansi, battling against the British. She took up the case of her adopted son. He was not allowed to succeed, and therefore, using doctrine of lapse, Jhansi had been annexed. She decided that she will join the lot of the rebels and fight back against the East India Company, and gave that famous cry, "Main apni Jhansi nahi dungi." She fought bravely, not just in Jhansi, but also in Gwalior. She had taken over the fort of Gwalior, and she fought and died defending that particular fort. In fact, the military general of East India Company who defeated her, Hugh Rose was his name, he has lavished a lot of praise on the way Rani of Jhansi fought and the way she died fighting the East India Company's rule. In Bihar, Kunwar Singh, a former Zamindar of Jagdishpur, he will lead the revolt in Bihar due to his grievances against the British. Okay, he was a big Zamindar, had lost Zamindari rights in that process, so he will become the leader over there, and a very important leader. Storm Center will emerge in Bihar because of him. In Bareilly, Khan Bahadur Khan. Don't get confused with Bakht Khan. This is a different person altogether. Khan Bahadur Khan, who will be a descendant of the former rulers of Rohilkhand. We have in previous lectures discussed who the Rohillas were and how they had established the state of Rohilkhand, how during Warren Hastings' times the Rohilla war had taken place and the state had been brutally suppressed. So a descendant of that house, Khan Bahadur Khan, was there at this point in Rohilkhand, and he will have a very, you can say, intense kind of a fight against the Britishers in Rohilkhand. So revolt in Bareilly will be led by Khan Bahadur Khan. Apart from this, Faizabad, where Maulvi Ahmadullah of Faizabad will fight against the British troops. So these were some of the major epicenters of the revolt about which we must know. Ultimately, starting with Delhi, slowly, steadily, each of these storm centers will fall to British counterattack. Yes, for several months, Indians who were fighting in these storm centers defied the attempts of East India Company to take over, but in the final analysis, East India Company was able to recover all of these places, starting with Delhi. For the sake of prelims, some of these names may be asked, so we must definitely know them. In Delhi, Indian leader was Bahadur Shah Zafar or Bahadur Shah II, and the British commander who will get back Delhi is John Nicholson. On the northern side of Delhi, from Kashmiri Gate onwards, you will see the area further ahead of Delhi Ridge. That is where British cantonment was, and that is where they were constantly bombarding the Kashmiri Gate, the northern side of Red Fort or the Shahjahanabad city, and then slowly, steadily advancing, they will come and fight at the Kashmiri Gate. If ever you go to Delhi and happen to visit that place, it's a very historic place, the Kashmiri Gate, where a lot of this fighting took place. And after a few months, valiant resistance by troops inside of Delhi, the city of Delhi will fall to John Nicholson. and John Nicholson will also, let loose the British troops who will do a lot of, massacre in Delhi. A lot of people were killed in Delhi. The Jama Masjid itself was occupied by the Britishers and was not available for worship for several days thereafter. Bahadur Shah Zafar's sons and grandsons, they were shot by one British officer by the name, I think Hudson or Hodson, something his name was. So he had shot, Mughal princes, and it is said that their heads, severed heads, were offered in a tray to the grand old ruler. After this, Bahadur Shah Zafar will be sent away from Delhi to Rangoon. He will die or pass away in Rangoon, surrounded by just a few family members. And he has spent very poignant lines there in Rangoon, describing his predicament of what has happened to him and to his family, the house of the Mughals. ना किसी के आंख का नूर हूं, ना किसी के दिल का करार हूं, ना किसी के आंख का नूर हूं, ना किसी के दिल का करार हूं, जो किसी के काम ना आ सका, मैं वो मुश्तो गुबार हूं. I am not the solace of any eye. I am not the comfort of any heart. I am that speck of dust which could not be of any use for anyone. That is Bahadur Shah Zafar, poignantly trying to think over his situation. So he dies there in Rangoon, does not even get a place of burial in his place, Delhi. After this, Lucknow, Begum Hazrat Mahal, Henry Lawrence will be the leader of the Britishers, but he will also die there in that battle. Henry Lawrence, the same famous Henry Lawrence who had helped Lord Dalhousie take over Punjab. Kanpur, Nana Sahib, the Indian leader, and Sir Colin Campbell, he will take over Kanpur, and he will order, a mass kind of a massacre in Kanpur in retribution of what had happened on the ghats of the river when Europeans were trying to escape. In Jhansi and Gwalior, Lakshmi Bai and Tatya Tope, they fight bravely, and General Hugh Rose will defeat Rani of Jhansi. In Bareilly, Khan Bahadur Khan and Sir Colin Campbell, the same person over here, Sir Colin Campbell. Allahabad and Benares, Maulvi Liaquat Ali, Colonel Onsal, and Bihar, Kunwar Singh and William Tyler, the British officer. Just in case there's a match the following or prelims based question, we must know some of these personalities associated with specific centers. Now let us see the causes of failure of this revolt. What were the reasons why this revolt failed? Despite the huge shock, that revolt of 1857, the big jolt that it gave, ultimately East India Company was still able to recover all of these territories. What were the reasons why Indians could not dislodge the Britishers? Number one, this revolt was not all India in character. Its main centers were in the plains, northern and central Indian plains. South India was largely unaffected. In Western India, some disturbances were there, but nothing that significant. Bengal proper also not that badly affected. Punjab and all of those areas beyond their Sindh, they were not affected. Consequently, this was not really an all India revolt. Therefore, resources from other areas could be marshaled for this fight in north and central plains. Bombay and Madras armies remained loyal while Bengal army had rebelled. The same thing we do not see in case of Bombay and Madras. Please remember, at this time, the armies, Bombay, Bengal, Madras, these are three separate armies for all practical purposes. Okay, their traditions, their systems, everything is different. They evolved through a different process. And consequently, what was happening in Bengal army did not have an effect on Bombay and Madras. Also, one important reason was the composition, the communities that were there in Bombay and Madras army, as well as versus the communities in the Bengal army. So the religious sensitivity of the upper castes was much more pronounced in case of Bengal army. Bombay and Madras, on the other hand, had a quite different composition in terms of troops. Lack of resources. These troops, when they are fighting, they had gathered whatever weapons and ammunition they could from East India Company's arsenals. But beyond that, they did not have significant amounts of weapons and ammo. Consequently, East India Company was in a much better position in that sense. There was no centralized leadership or planning on part of Indians. Bahadur Shah Zafar is just a nominal head. in each of these storm centers, everyone is going about doing their stuff parallel. There is hardly any mechanism for larger coordination and planning. Yes, we do read about some forms of communication going about before and during the revolt, but that is certainly not in any way significant enough to have a proper planned kind of an uprising against British rule. Lack of coherent ideology. Ideology really gives you, not only the justification, but it also gives you the strength to carry on. This was a revolt only to reverse back the clock's hands, going back to earlier times. Beyond that, it did not have any modern ideology as such, unlike what we will see later in freedom struggle under Gandhiji and others. So the goal was only to go back to earlier feudal times where Rajas, Maharajas, Zamindars, Talukdars, all of these people were actually the social elites. Indian intellectuals also were not very keen about this revolt. Indian intellectuals felt that Europeans in many ways were benefiting the Indian society. The ban on sati, widow remarriage, abolition of slavery, stopping of human sacrifice, stopping of child infanticide, bringing in of modern Western education, all of these things were seen as fruits of the Western rule. Consequently, Indian intellectuals felt that it is better than going back to the earlier feudal and backward times, and hence we do not see that sort of a support. Many princes, zamindars and moneylenders also supported the British. The Scindias, the Holkars, Nizam of Hyderabad, the state of Jodhpur, many other princely states from India, they actually sided with the British, provided them with resources, men, material in this deadly hour of theirs. In fact, Canning apparently had written about one Indian prince that in case that Indian prince shifts his allegiance to the rebel side, then in that case I'll have to pack my bag. So that was the kind of situation where Indian princes were supporting the British. I mean, many are fighting, but then there are some who are siding with the British also. The British, on the other hand, they had a very centralized command and leadership. Using their means of communications like telegraph, postage system, they were able to have a much better counter to this revolt of 1857. Centralized command and planning came to great help for Britishers, unlike in case of Indians. They also had great leaders in the form of Hugh Rose, Campbell, Henry Lawrence, Lord Canning. All of these were exceptionally competent leaders who took this task as a matter of survival and death. For them, their survival in India, physical existence itself, was now hinging on the outcome of this revolt, and they rose to this occasion, and therefore we see they were able to suppress the Indian revolters. They also had better resources in terms of arms, men, railway, although it has just started, but then they have it, telegraph, postage. All of these systems of communication were of great help to the Britishers. In fact, a rebel before being hanged, a rebel of revolt of 1857, before being hanged, he had famously said that we are not being hanged by that rope, we are being hanged by the telegraph line. So that very aptly captures the importance of telegraph in that day and age. They also had a clear ideology as to what they were doing. They are colonial ideology, although it is exploitative, but for them, they have clarity about it, that this is what they want to achieve, and that clarity enabled them to surpass their limits and rise to the occasion to suppress the Indian revolt. So these became the significant causes of victory for the Britishers. In this lecture, we have discussed the genesis of the revolt of 1857, understood the important characters, seen the major storm centers, and also tried to reflect on the reasons for failure of Indians and success of the Britishers. In our next class, we will discuss the impact of a revolt of 1857. We will see how Britishers will come out with the Queen's Proclamation and later the Council Act to actually assuage, Government of India Act and Council of India Act later, to assuage Indians, to assure them that British rule was basically intended with a positive intent for Indians. All of that is coming up in our discussion in the next class, guys. If you've liked this lecture, then do smash that like button, leave a comment in the comment box, and share this video with your friends. Thank you very much. I'll see you in my next class.